Hi everybody, my name's Julia from Bobbins and Buttons. My business and my channel are all about sewing and mainly about helping people make clothes that they love. So today I've got a tutorial for how to make a doorstop. I know this is nothing to do with making your own clothing, but what's been happening is over the summer months I've been running my workshops in my studio, and because it's so well insulated, it's got really warm, and I've had the door wide open and it's just been sort of chocked open with an old table, and every time there's a slight breeze the table blows over and the door shuts. So I thought I really need to make myself a doorstop, but because the door opens outways I really wanted a doorstop that was a bit weatherproof. So I've made it in coated cotton so it's slightly waterproof, and I've also made it so it's got a detachable cover, so it's almost like a zip cover on it, and then the sandbag's sealed inside so I can take the cover off and wash it if it does start to get dirty. So I just thought I'd share it with you. It might be useful for you as well. So let me show you what it looks like. It is very heavy. Here it is. So it has a handle here, and then it's full of sand at the bottom, and then you can see there the zip at the bottom, so I can open that up and take the cover off if I need to wash it. So I have been using it. It has been really good. It's been rained on a few times and it's survived, so I'm pretty happy with it. So I hope you find this useful. Let me show you how to make it. So I'm going to start by showing you how to make the template or pattern for the doorstop. This is my pattern that I've made for my doorstop. I have made this extra long because I'm using it for an external door. So when the doors open where I want it to stay, there's a large gap between the bottom of the door and the ground. So I need to kind of cater for that as well as have some weight above it so that it's effective as a doorstop. So I will share the dimensions of my doorstop, but you might want to consider making it a bit smaller, shorter if you're, especially if you're using it for an internal door. So I'll just go through what we need. We need a pair of scissors. Make sure you've got scissors dedicated for paper. Don't use your fabric scissors or they will go blunt. You need a pencil or a pen, something to draw out your pattern with. Ideally, if you've got a ruler with a right angle, that's going to make life a lot easier, but any ruler you can work with for this simple pattern. And then a piece of paper. So the paper just needs to be, I'm using spot and cross, but anything large enough to draw out your pattern will be fine, or you might need to stick a few pieces of A4 together with sellotape or something to make it big enough. And then we can get started making the pattern. So when I make a pattern like this, I like to start off with a folded piece of paper so that I can draw on half the pattern, and then when I cut it out and open it up, I've got a perfectly symmetrical pattern. So this pattern, this is where I started with my fold line. I drew the pattern out, and then this is the front and the back piece, so they're both exactly the same. So in essence, this is going to be a quarter of the measurement of your doorstop. So I'm going to, in a minute, draw out this shape and show you how I've come up with the shape, but it's not going to be to the same scale as this because that's a little bit large to fit into the camera frame. So I'm just going to talk through the dimensions on this and how I've come up with these measurements. So what I did to start with was I just took the tape measure to the door, and I started by measuring the gap between the door and the ground because I needed to kind of add that on top of what I wanted the final depth to be. So I came up with a final depth that I wanted the doorstop to finish at 44 centimetres. And to that I've added a 5 centimetre base. So this is half of it because obviously this is only the front. So it's going to be a 10 centimetre in total base and a 1.5 seam allowance at the top. So onto my 44 centimetre finished size, I've added 6.5 centimetres, so I come up with 50.5 centimetres for the entire length of this pattern. So for the base, I haven't really got any great science for this. I've just kind of visualised how I think it's going to look based on the length. So I think it needs to be quite substantial at the bottom so that the shape looks balanced. But what I'd recommend, if you're not too sure how it's going to look, is I'd just cut it out of a rough piece of fabric and quickly sew it together, and you can kind of get a gauge of how it looks a lot better when it's an actual piece of fabric, three-dimensional shape. So the measurement I've used here is 18 centimetres. So again, that includes the 5 centimetre gusset, which will become a kind of side gusset at this point, and then the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So now that we've got those measurements, we can start by drawing our rectangle onto the folded piece of paper. So we want to, I'm not doing it to scale, but I'll use the measurements that I've just discussed so it doesn't get too confusing. So to start with, we want the widest point is 18 centimetres. So I'm going to lay the right angle on the ruler against the folded edge and make sure that's really nice and lined up properly, and then mark in our 18 centimetres, and then we want to measure our 50.5 or whatever length you've come up with, and mark another right angle at the other end. And what I'm doing is where our 18 centimetre comes out to, I'm just doing a little point at both of those, and then we can square across. But I like to just check, because sometimes it's very easy for the ruler just to slightly go off by a mil or 2 mil, and the line starts getting a lot less accurate if that happens. So I'm just going to square that from that end and square that from that end. And so now we've got our rectangle drawn on the paper. So the next thing we need to do is to create the gusset corners, and all that is an exact square that's cut out of the corner. So if you do have a pattern ruler like this, you'll have a very easy job, because all you need to do is to line up whatever depth you're going with. So in our case, 5 centimetres. So all of these lines are 0.5 centimetre on this ruler, and there's a similar thing on a quilt ruler. So you can just line up your 5 centimetre line with the base and draw in a line across, and then you want to be 5 centimetres in from the edge as well. So again, we put the 5 centimetre line on the first line that we've drawn and square that up with the first line, and there you've got a nice perfect square cut out. So that makes our gusset. And then lastly, we just want to shape to the top. So I'm making a handle that's quite wide. I'm going to make it around about 8 centimetres wide. So I'm happy to have a bit of length beyond the width of my handle. So if I mark where the handle's going to end up, or roughly end up, I can see that that's where the handle is. So I kind of want a little bit beyond that, but not too much. So again, I'm just doing that by eye, and then I'm going to draw that point down to the point at this corner here, and just angle that across. So there's our pattern. So we can now cut that out, and all I need to do is a rectangle, which I'm just going to draw directly onto the fabric for the handle. I'll just explain what dimensions I've done that. So to cut this out, if you feel fairly confident and it's not too big, you should be able to just cut it out as it is. If you feel like it's going to move too much, you could pin it together to stop it moving. If you hold it fairly flat to the table, you can usually do it fairly easily. So there's your complete pattern. So this now is the front and back pattern for your doorstop. And because I'm making the version that's going to have the internal sandbag, I'm now going to draw a line across the top, which is where I'm going to cut the lining piece to. So for that, again, I've just kind of estimated, and I could, you know, potentially I might need to change this. So I'm going to draw a line about 2/3 up the length of the doorstop to make the line for the lining. So to draw that line, we've got I can see the crease line nice and clearly, so I'm just going to draw that in, and again put the right angle line across. This can be a little bit estimated, and draw a line. So when we cut out the lining, I'm just going to fold that down to that line, make that the lining pattern and that the outer pattern. Then the last thing I need to do now is just to create the pattern for, or like I said, I'm not actually going to make a pattern for the strap. So I quite often just write on my patterns the dimension that I want the strap to be. So in this case, I'm going with 10 centimetres by 28 centimetres. So I can just write 10 by 28 centimetres, and that will just be a rectangle. I'll cut 2 of those, and that will make 1 loop for the top. So now that the pattern's ready, I've cut my pieces out. So I'm using this coated cotton, which is slightly waterproof, which I think is going to be good for my outdoor doorstop. So I've cut 2 of the main pattern piece in the coated cotton, and then I've cut 2 in a piece of old calico for my internal linings to the shorter line, and then I've cut 2 of the strap pieces, which is going to make my big strap at the top to hold it together, or to pull it up. So the first thing to do is to insert the zip. So the zip is going in the widest end, so below the cutouts that you've made, and you've got your front and your back. I was quite lucky that this zip actually was exactly the right size. It could be something that you consider when you're actually drafting the pattern. You could make the bottom width to the size of your zip to make life easy. But what I would have done if I hadn't had the exact size zip, I would have used a longer one. I would have started the zip stitching, or the end of the zip where the metal bar is. I would have brought that in 1.5 to make sure that I don't sew that when I close these corners, and then I would have trimmed the length off at this end, but only after all the seams are finished, and this the pulley isn't likely to come flying off the end at that point. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew the handles together, so we're ready to make the doorstop. So I've got my 2 pieces, and I'm going to sew the long edges and turn it through one of the short edges. So there's my strap. So I just need to, I've just stitched that. I'm just going to turn that through. Nice wide strap. And even though this is made from coated cotton, I can still press it gently. So I'm just going to give this strap a quick press, and I think I might top stitch the edges of this strap just to make it look a little bit neater. So I'm just going to top stitch down these 2 edges. So there's our strap all finished and top stitched. So what I've done is I've just folded it in half and done a little nick in the centre at either end, so that we can put that to the centre of the top of the doorstop. So I've also done that with the top piece here, so we've got a little nick. So now I can just bring these two edges together and match up all those centre little nicks. And because it's coated cotton, rather than pinning it, I'm just using these little wonder clips because they're quite good. They don't pierce the fabric in the same way as pins. So I'm just going to stitch that in place to hold it, and then we're ready to stitch round all the edges. So now that that's stitched in place, we're ready to sew the edges together. So just before you do that, I would just open the zip, because you will find it a little bit tricky to get inside otherwise. So now we can clip it together all around the long edges and across the top. At the moment we're not doing anything with these corner edges, so just starting from one lower edge. I'm going to use the wonder clips again because they work quite nicely with coated cotton, and just clip that. The handle will be inside. And then we'll come down and finish here. So I'll just go and stitch that, and then I'll come back and show you how that looks. So the last part to stitch is these little corners. So the way to do that is to bring the seams together. So we want the seam, the zip seam and the side seam to come together. So if you pull it out, if you start with the closed end of the zip, and you can open out the side seam and just make sure the zip seam is lined up with the side seam, and then pull that apart. And what we want is just to stitch right across the edge using a 1.5 seam allowance. Sometimes because of the angle it feels a bit odd to sew this, so it can be quite a good idea just to draw a line. So if I put the 1.5 seam allowance line on the edge there, I can just draw a line with chalk, and you can see where you're going to sew. So I'm just bypassing that little metal end of the zip as well. I can see that, which is quite handy. So I'm going to clip that. And then on the other end, this is slightly more tricky because your zip needs to be open a little bit at this point, because you won't get your machine foot close to the puller. So we're doing the same thing again, but you need to just kind of manually bring the zip closed. So we're going to butt those two edges up over the seam line. And just put a couple of clips there to hold that. And again, you can draw a line. I mean, I've put the clips in before I've drawn the line, which isn't very sensible, but I can probably just get in there to show you. So we can go and sew those two edges, and then we're ready to turn it all through. So that's all stitched together, and this is where it's handy to have the zip pull opened a little bit, so you can get your finger inside and just start turning this through. You might need to just trim off a little bit of the corner, but I'm going to just try folding that in and keeping that all intact, because I think it will still work quite well with this fabric. So now all we need to do is make the internal sandbag to go in our cover. There we go. So I've made the calico internal bag exactly the same as the outer bag, except obviously there's no zip along the bottom, and I've left the top open, which is where the strap was on the outer. So now I'm going to turn this through to the right side, and fill this with sand. The one thing I have done with this internal bag is I've taken the stitch size down to a very small 2mm size stitch, because obviously it's going to be filled with sand and I don't want to avoid any kind of leakage. And this is where it's going to be a bit tricky now, because I'm going to fill this up with sand, and then I'm hoping that I can get the sand to about here and still manage to machine this shut once it's filled with sand. So I'm not sure how that's going to go right now, but I'm going to go and give it a try. That was definitely a very tricky thing to do. So I actually got to the point where I realised I wouldn't be able to get it under the machine with the amount of sand that I wanted in the bag. So I actually hand tacked the top closed and then tried to sew it under the sewing machine. But in actual fact I only managed to get halfway along and then start the other end, and even that was pretty tricky to actually get it under the sewing machine even when it was closed. So if anybody finds a good way of doing that, please do feel free to leave it in the comments below. But what I've done is I've tightly stitched that together by hand so that the sand doesn't spill out. And it is a very good weighty doorstop, I think. So all I need to do now is put it inside the external covering. There we are. So there it is, all complete. It's definitely quite tricky to get it inside the outer casing, so, and in hindsight I would definitely recommend that you make the inner bag almost as long as the outer bag, so you've got a better chance of getting it under the sewing machine. You definitely don't want to get sand inside your sewing machine. That would be a bit of a disaster. So if you don't feel confident in sewing it up with a sewing machine, I'd definitely stick to hand sewing that closed. And don't overfill the sand bag or you won't be able to get it inside at all. So this one was a little bit touch and go, to be honest. So I think I probably wouldn't quite fill it as much. And I used a soup ladle to put the sand inside, and I also found kiln dried sand at the DIY shop, and I thought that was quite good, because you definitely don't want wet sand going into one of these, but the sand is making it really weighty. So I'm now going to go and put it at my studio door and let some fresh air in. So I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. If you'd like to see more videos and tutorials, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.